Good evening and welcome to Foucault 613. Il faut défendre la société. Society must be defended. As you know, these 11 lectures taught by Foucault during the winter and the spring of 1976 were also the first one to be published. First by Alessandro Fontana in Italian, and then they were published in the original in 1997. Foucault begins his lectures with a series of remarks about the conditions in which he has to lecture. Tens of people crowding the room in which he is teaching, and an overflow room nearby with as many people listening to him. He says, it's not even a spectacle, we don't see each other. He decided to meet earlier at 9:30 in the morning because apparently students didn't know how to get up early anymore. So he thought it was a very good selection criteria. But he's not terribly worried about changes in the audience, as in any case, there are always the little mics here and the tape machines, and word gets around afterward. Sometimes it remains on tape, sometimes it is transcribed, and sometimes it turns up in the bookshops. So I said to myself, he says to himself, word always gets out. And word indeed got out, and still does. These lectures were taught between the publication of Surveiller et Punir in 1975 and the fourth volume of Histoire de la sexualité, la volonté de savoir, on November 17, 1976. The lectures begin with a diagnosis of what he's been doing the last few years. And afterwards, he engages in a reflection on disciplinary power that take most of the time of January 14. By the end, Foucault theorizes, by the end of the lectures, Foucault theorizes over the concept of biopolitics and biopower. While disciplinary power, Foucault says, works at the level of the individual, biopower works at the level of the species. In his view, what Foucault is finally exploring is the emergence of a regulatory society that consists in making live and letting die, a turn from sovereign power defined by Foucault with the medieval expression reserved for merum imperium by lawyers, de potestas gladi. Last week, we were discussing, among other things, the very concept of norm and normalization, focusing on Foucault's reading of Canguilhem's idea that norms are always in the making. In Society Must Be Defended, the norm plays a central role as it is at the intersection between disciplinary power and regulatory power. Something, he says, that can be applied to both a body one wishes to discipline and the population one wishes to regularize. As Foucault puts it in his lesson of January 21st, 1976, the war that is going on beneath order and peace, the war that undermines our society and divides it in a binary mode, is basically a race war. At a very early stage, we find the basic elements that make the war possible and then ensure its continuation, pursuit, and development. Ethnic differences, differences between languages, different degrees of force, vigor, energy, and violence, the difference between savagery and barbarism, the conquest and subjugation of one race by another. The social body is basically articulated around two races. It is with this idea in mind that he goes on to say, I would like to trace the history of this theory of races, or rather, a race war during the French Revolution and especially in the early 19th century. He wants to pursue the study of how philology and anatomophysiology supported each other in order to give birth to the theory of races in the historical biological sense of the term. His purpose includes another important transcription based on the theme and theory of social war, which emerges in the very first years of the 19th century and which tends to erase every trace of racial conflict in order to define itself as a class struggle. Defining society, defining race, and defining power will take most of these lectures, in which Foucault runs up and down in history from the 16th century, from Machiavellian Hobbes and the theories of sovereignty, to the 19th century and the many emergences of different kinds of power for which, as he mentions in an interview in 1977, he did not have a general theory. Not having a general theory of power, or, as he puts it, being a blind empiricist, is what makes these lectures so vibrant, but sometimes also difficult to grasp, like when on February 4th, he tries to answer a series of questions asked by students, both orally and in written. Why has he limited himself to the study of race and racism, to the state and the theory of sovereignty? His answer became, in fact, a matter of discussion for medievalists and is still alive today. Michel Foucault promised at the beginning of these lectures that the research projects taking place in his classes were, and I quote in French because the English translation is slightly frustrating in this point, des pistes de recherche, des idées, des schémas, des pointillés, des instruments. Faites-en ce que vous voulez. À la limite, cela m'intéresse et cela ne me regarde pas. But society must be defended became indeed a turning point in Foucault's thought and conceptual creativity. He focused on biopower, biopolitics, and biohistory, a triptych of concepts that would occupy him in future years. That same year, on October 1976, Foucault published in Le Monde a review of Jacques Ruffier's De la biologie à la culture. In it, he reconnected his recent research with the ways that he would pursue immediately afterwards. Blood markers, he says, are for the current problem of races what sexual characters were for the study of a species in Linné's time. These and other issues treated by Ruffier allow us to see, he says, the clear formulation, the main questions for a biohistory that would no longer be the unitary and mythological history of the human species throughout time. The main questions for a biopolitics that will no longer be that of the divisions, preservations, and hierarchies, but that of communication and polymorphism. Now, today we have three interventions that will pose some of the most vibrant questions raised by society must be defended. In the first place, Anne Stoller, Willy Brandt Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the New School, author of the well-known book Along the Archival Grain and recent foundational soul of the political concepts lexicon, and is now working on her new book, Duress, Concept Work for Our Times. Then, Partha Chatterjee will follow. In addition to being a playwright and an actor, Partha is also a professor of anthropology and of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies. I think that's an addition, right? His last book is The Black Hole of Empire, History of a Global Practice of Power. Third, we will have the intervention of Robert Gooding Williams, the M. Moran Weston Black Alumni Council Professor of African American Studies here at Columbia. He is also a philosopher and the founding director of the Center for Race, Philosophy, and Social Justice. His last book is the award-winning In the Shadow of Dubois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America. And then Bernard Harcourt will finally respond and begin the conversation. Thank you. Anne, please.
Jesus, thank you. So let me begin quickly. We've been given a really stringent timetable this time. No going on for 45 minutes allowed, we've been told. But we are going to try, and I'm not sure I can do it in 20 minutes, but I'm going to do whatever I can. I also have a mea culpa because my eyes have gotten very good as I've gotten old, and my glasses don't really work. So let me begin quickly by first thanking and celebrating Bernard and Jesus for conceiving of this project. And I'm just, for those of you who have read the blog, I'm sort of truncated it all so I can get to the second part, but there are always a lot of people who haven't read it, so I'm sort of trying to make it available, for conceiving of this project and for making possible the participation of so many of us long immersed in Foucault's work, the gathering in of those for whom Foucault has perhaps remained a distant locator as well, and for all of us, enabling the collective experience of an intellectual and, I think, a political vertigo, in finding ourselves following new threads, humbled by what we had not seen before, and I speak for myself, animated by these successive occasions to track his precision and precarious, and I think we might even say sometimes dubious leaps, offered by working so slowly, and it's amazing that it just doesn't feel quite slowly enough, through each of these 13 years of his arduous analytic movement and labor. For what emerges, I think, in this venture, that is us here, as perhaps never before, is not only the force of the vocabularies and concepts we've long rehearsed, here offered in a demonstrative and historical activation, but strikingly precipitant moments in which knowledge is not only only proprietary until the moment it is reappropriated and seized. The discourses of races and then race can be mobilized by different adversaries, serve domination and insurrectionary challenges as well. Like war, it is exemplary of that tactical polyvalence that is neither uniform nor stable, of which Foucault first writes in the history of sexuality, garnered by different constituencies at different moments for very different political ends. This is not a model of dominant discourse on one side and subaltern discourse on the other, as we discussed last week. Foucault's analytic provides for the ugly and glorious forms of insurrection to which qualified knowledges can never be sufficiently protected, for occasions for usurpations are enabled by qualified knowledges themselves. We know that our project is not to find the originary site or kernel of his thinking, a project he would have abhorred, but rather the dispersed beginnings, the evident in the reversals and arrested gestures, the quixotic forms in which a genealogical pursuit defies any smooth course, the easy access it warns against and wards off. This is something that the accretion of Foucault's thinking with our own seems to highlight, make more available to concern query and collective thought. This is not to argue, then, for a teleological sighting, and it's kind of hard to resist it, right? As we've been done, all the traces leading to this ultimate crescendo in state racism or in the conceptualization of a biopolitical regime, but something equally difficult to capture. What I see is a doubly inflected genealogical pursuit, one of Foucault's own thought, both the intensified as well as abandoned trajectories, the deviations from what seemed to be his course, and as mentioned last week, his transformed thinking, for example, of around a dispositif. And two, coupled with this first, the making and enacting of a vivid genealogical exercise, tracing the emergence of a lethal political morphology that he tracks methodologically through this tactical reversibility, as he keeps calling it, in knowledge production. That is very interesting, we haven't discussed it yet, that is proportional, he says, to the homogeneity of a field. It is the clarity and the credibility of this luminous insight that I'd like to speak to in the second half of this talk today. But first, should we ever have imagined that Foucault was writing a history of sexuality, of racism, or of the state, he insists he is not. That he's instead after something else that he names in the lecture that will follow, a sort of reflective prism, a practico-reflexive prism that he sought to isolate. The adjective reflexive here is key, for it's how something has come to be reflected upon, has become made real as a discernible knowledge thing. Epistemologically, how do we know what we know? How did they think they knew what they knew? Politically, what are its effects? And how does a set of reflective, strategic alignments in the making of knowledge create that which it is purported only to have described? The prism signals a crucial reworking as well, because it is this prism that elsewhere comes to be vaguely designated in the following lectures as a set of correlations that will mark this analytic moment as different from what's come before. None of the lectures, to my mind, so searingly speak to the query, why Foucault now, as those we convene around today. And I am taking to heart Bernard Agnès' invitation to resist a faster pace, but it's still hard not to resist speaking to this moment. If one ever wondered about the relevance of Foucault's lectures to our contemporary condition, the events of last week do more than bring them into sharp relief. With France's President Hollande declared that their assaults last week were an act of war on the part of ISIS, his affirmation that France is now suddenly at war both confirms and denies the very analysis that Foucault here so insists upon. On the one hand, instantiating a discourse of war ingrained in modern politics, strategically called upon to galvanize new forms of force and condone more directed violence. On the other hand, erasing the very duration and durability of this composite of historical relations of war, not precipitated by ISIS, but part and parcel of an ongoing, permanent war. Or is it these sedimented wars? It's not altogether clear, of which ISIS may be seen as the effect, the consequence of a lethal war of biopoliticized, racialized state in their life-affirming mode. Having written about these lectures some 20 years ago, before they were published, broaching them today in this high-voltage, violating, racialized present, I'm neither assuming that race in the education of desire is a known quantity, nor will I rehearse what I've written before. The work I was doing in the early 1990s, for those of you who might not know, then steeped in the Dutch and French colonial archives, tracking the management of sexuality as an especially dense transfer point of power, collusively implicated with race in the making of colonial government, made it hard not to ask at that time why Foucault set aside so assiduously those very sites where his case could have been so persuasively and otherwise made. And then there was his invocation of state racism emerging in the final chapter of the history of sexuality, which he opined no one ever got to. The reception when the final 1976 lecture appeared in Le Temps Moderne in 1991 under the totally unambiguous and one would think grabbing title, To Make, Live, and Let Die, The Birth of Racism, barely mentioned an intellectual or political nod. And again, when the full year's lectures were published in 1997, it was biopower, and decidedly not state racism that commanded attention. But perhaps what was most disquieting for me in talking between French colonial archives and the heavily racialized world of Provence and Marseille, where I was doing research on the FN in 1997, was why in discerning these lineaments of state racism, the genocidal properties of the biopolitical form, Foucault would turn to the Nazi and socialist state. In 1995, I asked why he had done so, why, when he had sought the terrain of modern, deadly biopolitical regimes, he had not turned to imperial formations themselves, not the backwater to the modern, but as those in critical colonial studies have long argued, were the very sites where the institutional apparatuses and techniques of power, ricocheting between metropole and colony, provided the conditions and possibility for it. And this notion of, we should remember that he notes this return effect, this effet de retour, right, in the 16th century with respect to the war of races that were to transform in the 19th century to state racism, but never mentions that return effect again. But in 1997, another question seemed as pressing, not why he had not turned to this boomerang effect, as it's sometimes called, but why not to France, and why his interlocutors still had not done so. In the 1950s, the French racial state was in confident fluorescence. Its French citizens of Algerian and Moroccan origin were commonly referred to as immigrants, and Homo academicus rehearsed that designation, as some still do today. The French government in 1974 put a halt on what was perceived as an excess of immigration that had been so encouraged when the economy called on those male bodies in the decade before. And the HLM, the low-income housing deadline in the 1950s to contain them on the outskirts of Paris, that expanded enormously in the mid-1970s, coincided, of course, as we know, with Foucault's most prolific moments. And should we imagine that the injunction to abandon and to laisser mourir took primary shape in the extremes of the Gulag and Nazi camps, we might remember that in 1968, just under half of the HLM were still without sanitary facilities. This is the slow violence Rob Nixon describes, citing Rachel Carson's, I quote, death by indirection, so resonant with Foucault's, what he identified in his final 1976 lectures. I quote, "When I say killing, I obviously do not mean simply murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on." One could argue that Foucault's target was broader and therefore there was no need to call out France by name, that it's flat-footed on my part to point to the history of racism because this is not what he was after, or that what he sought to highlight, as he often claimed, were extremes. That turned always to extremes, that pairing the Soviet Gulag and the German Nazi state put into dramatic and counterintuitive relief his argument that biopolitical regimes and normalization can and do their work at different ends of the political spectrum. But it is also he who has taught us that the prosaic forms of exposure and privation are as powerful and insidious as those of a more horrific cachet. It's hard to ignore that he chose to circumvent a homegrown target, namely how inherently such a normalizing racialized regime was made in France. Of course, it was and is his conceptual armature that provides us with a guide to not imagine a state racism initiated with respect to colonialism and external enemies alone, but as deeply fundamental to the making of European biopolitical states, where their need to defend society against internal enemies and internal dangers, directed at the dangers born in its own body. Still, I would argue that it matters to our efforts to locate the political struggles that informed his analytics, to attend to those that remained, as did empire, largely evaded or displaced. In what follows, I'm going to try to locate some of the elusive, troubling, and I think extraordinary moments in his analysis that I've wrestled with, and I hope for others merit their attention. I hope to have time to explore, and I'm not going to get through them all, Foucault's treatment of historical transformations, and to argue that discontinuity neither captures his analytics nor what he urges as mobile thought. Here I look to what I see as the recursive nature of his understanding of history and the vocabulary he enlists to point us towards it. This recursive quality is demanding analytic effects. Rather than animating a search for sharp epistemic breaks, it challenges us to understand a more subtle re-weighting of how power works, the co-temporaneous but changing balance and articulation between sovereign power, disciplinary power, biopolitical power, and normalization. These recursions are evident, too, in the nature of the work that war does for Foucault as well, and the shifting terrain on which the figure of war stands. How might we understand its deployment? And this is part of what I'm sort of troubled with, as an idiom of the genealogical work performed at the same time that it provides the principle of analysis. The epistemic and political organizing grammar of historiography and historical confrontations themselves. And in some ways, return to one of the questions that came up last week. Is it that genealogical assaults and eruptions must take the form, but not the content and valence of that to which they are opposed, as they are usurped from within? And finally, I had hoped to address, and this is one we're probably not going to get to, what I see as a political and analytic conundrum, and then a subject we haven't really broached yet so far. Foucault's turn away, on the one hand, from intention, away from the sort of questions he disdained with respect to what power is. What is he trying to do, right? What's going on in his head? And then coupled with this categorical dismissal of intention, a simultaneous attentiveness to how subjectivities are constituted and reformed, educated to certain desires, humiliated by having others, made fearful of an enemy within, mobilized to imagine a construed enemy storming the European fortress and crashing its gates. These sensibilities, as he tells us, are historically located. It is he who has reminded us that every sentiment has a history. So I want to suggest that what might be called an affective morphology underwrites and constitutes governance, as it does genealogical critiques of how not to be governed this much, in this way, by these people. my parsing of one of his crystalline definitions of critique. The impetus to act, emotion, both appears in his accounts and remains unarticulated, informing but somehow subjacent and askew from what warrants his trenchant political analysis. How can intention be eschewed and sentiment not? I start with a quandary and a reassessment that speaks to the sort of decidedly non-epical quality of the kind of historical analysis that Foucault was moving with and towards in this year's lectures. Briefly put, discontinuity and rupture have long been taken as key features of his innovative analytics. A rejection of the smooth continuities exemplified in the sorts of Braudelian history he railed against. A regime of truth or grid of intelligibility marked an historical moment with an epistemic break as a distinguishing marker. But something else, I think, is happening here, a significant modification of the nature of the analysis. And I'm not sure that it's not already there in the preceding lectures in part, but I've not been able to identify them as clearly as here. This is a more challenging analytics, one that makes more room for multiple forms of power operating simultaneously, the reflexive thinking that their co-present demands, the mechanisms weighing differently, recombining and producing new calibrations and configurations with different effects. Foucault will state this most clearly in the 1978 lectures, but I hold that it's already operating as a strategy of historical analysis here, in how the perception of the war, I quote, between races, and the perception are his words, which predates the notions of social Holocaust struggle, unquote, will refigure as a grid of intelligibility and operate differently when working through a biopolitical form. So in Security on Territory, Population, he writes, and excuse the long quote, but I think it's just an amazing, amazing quote of what this analytic move is. So there is not a series of successive elements, the appearance of the new causing the earlier ones to disappear. There is not the legal age, then disciplinary age, then the age of security. Mechanisms of security do not replace disciplinary mechanisms, which would have replaced juridico-legal mechanisms. And I think that we really often treat it that way. In reality, you have a series of complex edifices in which what changes is the dominant characteristics, or more exactly, the system of correlations between juridico, disciplinary mechanisms, and mechanisms of security. And then he says, but there's another history, more general, but of course, much more fuzzy history of the correlations and systems of the dominant feature, which determine that in a given society, a technology of security will be set up, taking up again and sometimes even multiplying juridical and disciplinary elements and redeploying them within its specific tactic. Thus, it is sometimes, as he says, the reutilization, as within state racism, of an earlier anti-Semitism, which had developed for other reasons. Or, as we find with the new technology of power in the second half of the 18th century, that it is not disciplinary, but it does not exclude disciplinary technology, but dovetails into it, integrates it, modifies it to some extent, and above all, uses it by sort of infiltrating itself, embedding itself in existing disciplinary techniques. Here, Foucault compels us to turn away from totalizing regimes and analysis, both. Rather, look to the ways in which new techniques exist at different levels, on different scales. And this is an awkward translation with a different bearing area. That's how it's translated in the English, but this une autre surface portante, another surface area, and using different instruments. To my mind, this insight is enormous. We no longer ask about the definitive break between new and old forms of power, replacing one another whole cloth. Colonial as opposed to post-colonial makes much less sense, with the former as if left over, a dead matter in a new present. We're asked instead to cut a different swath through the given rubrics for macropolities. Democratic, colonial, fascist, and their conceptual supports, those ready-made syntheses, as he called them in archaeology of knowledge, that conceal so much more than they reveal, that confer common features contrived as shared. We're urged instead to attend to scaling, to cotemporalities, to the specific sites where they are threaded through one another, not to what particular forms of governance are and call themselves, but what a sedimented set of governing techniques with a different distribution do. And it is that sort of distribution that I'm after. What I call this recursive analytics is marked by uneven, unsettled contingent qualities of forms of perception and power that fold back upon themselves, recuperating some elements, calling not on an earlier historical discourses in toto, but in strategically altered combination. Thus, what's retrieved is never a matter of mere occurrence or repetition. That he refused. It can never look the same. For at issue in this refolding of earlier forms is a revealing of new surfaces and planes. And one might add the insurrectionary preserved possibilities of another politics. In this approach, histories are marked less by rupture or continuity, but rather by, and this is the language he uses so much, processes of partial, modified, amplified, reinscriptions, retranscriptions, recuperations. Deleuze offers a related observation, noting that for Foucault, reactivations and traces are rarely isomorphic with what came before. They can cross and do cross thresholds, occur at different levels, cut transversal swaths on a diagonal axis, or as Foucault himself would put it, in orthogonal articulation. Foucault sometimes tentatively, sometimes explicitly, but often without explication, circles around this point, but I would argue that it underscores the mobile nature of power relations, reactive states of becoming something else. Such protean forms with moving parts then require of their practitioners to be opportunistic, to reflect on the consequences of readjustments, in calculated consideration of more direct pressure or less discipline or more self-cultivation. It invites us, I think, to refuse the move to before and after, and even to work against the wooden, if all too common conceptual containers of definitive past and present. This recalibration of Foucault's thought makes crucial sense of his understanding of the reflective quality of governance, how they thought about how they thought. For imperial governance, where disciplinary sovereign and biopolitical power quintessentially meet in the administering of security, these perceptions and practices prompt an avid concern for not only what is, but what might be. At another register, I think also in the punitive society, one also sees, I quote, to spot an action before it has been performed. The temporal thrust of the biopolitical state, with racism buttressing its logic, manifests in this obsessive concern for the protection of society from itself, from its internal threats, producing an ever amplified attention to the conditional, the subjunctive, and future tense. Colonial archives are lodged in this anticipatory temporal mode. If we think they may do X, we should do Y. If we think that their mixed-blood children will grow up to hate us, we better do B now. As is the Department of Homeland Security's techniques for assessing violent intent. Predictive assessments join here with preemptive angst in the name of security for a European colonial society's defense. Imperial formations have long housed security as a conceptual and political nexus of expulsion and containment, as it is today. Granting the overwhelming force of the analysis, some questions remain, and they probably derive from my own skewed archival work with colonial documents that speak to the governing idioms of architects versus those agents of governance on the ground. But is there not an ellipsis between the force of these perceptions, as he calls them, and the force they have to determine, the word he uses, what Paul Rabineau calls the middle rank, social engineers, who sometimes operate within these rubrics, and as often allied them. What gives this historiography, and he gives so much weight to it, to determining so much, the gravitas that it assumes, and how do we know what it really commands? Was and is, as he puts it, the program for political action, and then he calls a search for historical knowledge, so fully aligned. And that's at the base of what all of this it moves through. The question becomes crucial in understanding how war operates, and I'm getting close to the end, in these lectures for Foucault. And that's the conversion of a war of races into a state racism, with the idea of a war of races substituted by an idea of racial purity. This is the moment when racism is born, we're told, or that the conversion of the counter-history into a biological racism is in the making. The tactical mobility, again, of this discourse both defines its force and its vulnerability. No one group is its custodian or sole proprietor. Rejecting race as his basic problem, Foucault disclaims interest in tracking the mechanisms. And this is interesting, too. The mechanisms that were used, he says, to try to exclude, disqualify, or physically destroy a race. He says he's not interested in it, but in fact, a lot of the lecture is about that. Instead, he seeks, I quote, a certain analysis of the state, its institutions, and its power mechanisms. How a particular framing in which war is central obfuscates the fact that there is a permanent war, sometimes a quiet war, sometimes a murderous war that does not reduce to a war against a political enemy. Absolutely categorically, it's not a political enemy. War talk is enacted, not on the individual, but on the population, and it is in this form that it is ever more lethal. Still, if war is the watermark of peace for Foucault in the political discourse he analyzes, it careens at times from a pervasive, inescapable, indelible analytic that informs how historiography and the political lexicon of governance works. At the same time, it provisions his own lexical matrix, called on to fortify and provide the vocabulary for his methodological adversarial genealogical pursuit. For nearly every analytic and political move he makes is tethered to and guided by an image and language instead of tactics, as his genealogy of war. War almost seems to exceed and spill over the edges of analysis. There is at once methodological care and vertiginous speed with which Foucault writes and assaults the lazy reader, challenging us both to marvel at and endure the density of the details he marshals. War is everywhere in practice, words, and deeds of those he is analyzing and in his own confrontations with them. Is he and are we, I ask, caught within its web, defeated by its ubiquity before we've begun? Is it merely his strategy of a moment, an intervention aimed at those who wallowed in the pseudo-peace of repression, as he put it? Is it an internal battle with political theory, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Clausewitz, and liberal political theory, and those too easily invested in the clear distinction between war and peace? And what is the distinction, if any, and I don't have time to go into this, but and it comes out much more in the French, between war-like relations, les rapports guerriers, and what constitutes an undeclared or declared war proper? How do we reckon with the capacious terms in which war is used and the almost capricious call Foucault himself makes on its idioms? War adheres in the fictive peace of political theory and governing practice, in critique itself as a weapon of war, and in historiography as a sharpened instrument of war in its own right. When Foucault argues that, I quote, the theoretical unity of discourse must be, quote, cut up, ripped up, torn to shreds, I unquote. This might be only considered an instance of his hyperbolic prose, but I'm not sure it is. It is where the insurrection of subjugated knowledges makes itself felt, in confrontations and struggles. The confrontational tactics of genealogy are evident in Nietzsche's genealogy history of 5 years earlier, but it is here in these lectures where it's put to work. Foucault's turn away from resistance, as we have come to use that term, is absolutely right. As we noted last week, there is no resistance on one side and power on the other, with resistance a mere rebound, as he put it, much less the underside of domination, as we often call it, doomed to defeat. On the contrary, the warlike relations of power make them susceptible to reversals. Resistance, I quote, is inscribed in relations of power themselves, mobile and transitory points of resistance, fracturing unities and affecting regroupings, furrowing across individuals themselves. But there's also a trap. On January 7th, Foucault launches the year with an insurrectionary call against unitary theory and the forms of subsumption it produces and enlists. He warns us against being caught when the very genealogical fragments we have dug out of the sand will be recoded, recolonized by those same unitary discourses that first disqualified them and ignored them when they appeared, only to re-annex them and include them in their own discourses and their knowledge power effects. And then he reminds us that we are talking about, I quote, the battle that knowledges are weighing against the power of effects of scientific discourse, noting, and this is the important point, that it is probably over-optimistic, he says, to assume that our adversary's silence proves that he is afraid of us. He writes that, quote, the silence of an adversary, and this is a methodological principle or a tactical principle that must always be kept in mind, could just as easily be a sign that he is not afraid of us at all, unquote. Fear is what one wants to instill in the adversary. Fear to act, to speak, to assert that one's knowledge is qualified, and that which passes for qualified knowledge is a sham that occludes the relations of power and the stakes of the battle. In this adversarial relationship, where fear is a support, recruited, as in the abnormal lectures, to, quote, detect danger and counter it, the redistributions of affect may be more fundamental than we have usually thought. Security regimes depend upon it. Affective knowledge and its manipulation are at its core. In conclusion, or not really, but just to end, if truth, pareicia, in the form of fearless speech, is defined by a willingness to speak on the global web and in the local agora, and thus to take the risks of doing so to account for oneself, the polyvalence of truth claims has chilling consequences. Genealogical pursuits may not always, as we know too well, be on the side of what we, one adversary, imagines as the good. In this war of words and deeds, who speaks the truth and who will be considered to do so is subject to precisely genealogy's requirement to actualize the capacity for, quote, the violent and surreptitious appropriation of a system of rule, to impose a direction, to bend it to a new will, to force its participation in a different game. In such a bellicose scenario, an unstable mobile field of force, who will be designated the barbarian, and how broadly it will stick, may be, as Sparta also knows, perilously up for grabs. Thank you.
Thank you. Parto, please.
Thank you. Well, the subject of these lectures is war. Given all that's happening in France right now, it seems utterly appropriate that we should be looking back today at these lectures delivered by Michel Foucault in Paris in 1976. The best way for me to begin my discussion is to refer to Foucault's remarks in his lectures on the punitive society, which we discussed a few weeks ago, where he said that contrary to Hobbes's famous theoretical claim, establishing an absolute sovereign through a social contract does not, in fact, bring the civil war to an end. Rather, the civil war continues below the surface, as attested by the persistence of illegalities and frequent peasant and artisan revolts in the 18th and early 19th century. But when Foucault reads the testimonies of these rebellious groups, it is the moralization of delinquency and the moral condemnation of sovereign punishment that comes through most prominently. This moral tone did not go well with Foucault's subsequent demonstration of the penal reforms of the 19th century as an exercise in the economy of punishment, which is why I suspect the theme of civil war dropped out entirely from his book Discipline and Punish. In his 1976 lectures, he picks up the theme once more and develops, I think, a much more powerful argument about the continuation of war within a society that has been apparently pacified. Most interestingly, he does this through an examination of the rise of the modern disciplines of the human sciences on the one hand and historical discourse on the other. As a result, Foucault brings us face to face with a set of challenges that we as professional humanists or social scientists are reluctant to recognize. Let me begin by making a preliminary point about sovereign power. Hobbes's Leviathan was the absolute sovereign, the theoretical epitome of what Foucault described in Discipline and Punish as the classical form of sovereign power as a centralized repressive force. The problem of the modern regime of power, however, parallels a shift in the locus of sovereignty from the absolute monarch to an abstract construct called the people. This historical transition in the ground of legitimate sovereignty is, I believe, often missed in our discussion of Foucault's study of power, and Foucault himself may be at fault for not emphasizing the point sufficiently. But in his second lecture in Society Must Be Defended, Foucault says quite explicitly, quote, "Juridical systems, no matter whether they were theories or codes, allowed the democratization of sovereignty and the establishment of a public right articulated with collective sovereignty at the very time when, in the 19th century that is, to the extent that, and because, the democratization of sovereignty was heavily ballasted by the mechanisms of disciplinary coercion." That's page 37 in the English version. Foucault's project was to explain how modern power could function as mechanisms of domination grounded in the sovereignty of the people, while concealing domination behind the disciplinary forms of regulation and self-regulation. To show us the stakes involved in this project, Foucault temporarily sets aside the abstract juridical contractual concepts of political theory and jurisprudence and focuses instead on the discourse of history, particularly in 17th century England and 18th century France. The writers of these histories held a variety of ideological orientations, from radical levelers and diggers in England to reactionary aristocrats in France. But they wrote the history, says Foucault, of the struggle between races. Normans against Saxons, Romans against Gauls, Gauls against Franks. Race here is most definitely not a sociological category. Foucault is at pains to explain that our modern-day understanding of race as a sociobiological term is only one particular meaning, assumed by a word that for his purposes of elucidating the discourse of history in Europe must be understood in that far more general sense, defined, let us say, in the Oxford English Dictionary as, quote, "a group of people with a common feature." Unlike Hobbes's description of the anarchic state of nature, where each person is at war with everyone else, the race struggle in history takes place, where one group has, for the time being, asserted its dominance, while the other group seeks to overthrow that dominance. The war is between groups, collective entities called races, Normans, Saxons, Gauls, Franks, and it takes place below the surface of a system of laws made by the group that dominates the state. Foucault paraphrases, quote, "Law is not pacification, for beneath the law, war continues to rage in all the mechanisms of power, even the most regular. War is the motor behind institutions and order. In the smallest of its cogs, peace is waging a secret war." Page 50. Now, the crucial characteristic of the history of the race struggle is its contingency, indeterminacy, its irreducibly unpredictable character. Decisive outcomes are often the result of sheer accident. The historians show that the formation of great kingdoms are the result of invasion, conquest, usurpation, assassination. Victory and defeat in battle hinge on nothing more than mere chance. The lesson of this historical political discourse of the 17th or 18th century, and this is crucial for Foucault, is that there is no inherent moral legitimacy to the legally constituted state. It is simply the result of the temporary domination of one race over another. The subjugated race could, if it can seize the chance, overthrow the ruling power and establish its own dominance. These historians, therefore, do not proclaim any universal truth. They are partisan. They condemn the brutality and wickedness of those others who had overpowered and tricked the race into temporary subjugation. Even in defeat, they celebrate the bravery of their own race and anticipate its future victory. They reject the continuous genealogies with older sovereignties that conquering regimes claim for themselves. In other words, the histories of race struggle challenge the unity that theories of sovereignty seek to build for a pacified society, doggedly undermining the legitimacy of the established order of laws. They become a counter-history of the state. Foucault notes that the specific meaning of race could assume many forms, defined, for instance, by a common language or religion, but everywhere the counter-history would insist that two opposed groups are brought together within the unity of a polity only by the violent acts of war. From the 17th century onwards, beginning with Hobbes's theory of sovereignty, the disciplines of knowledge that would become the human sciences have tried assiduously to deny or at least suppress this bloody history of the formation of states. Foucault thinks Hobbes desperately wanted to reject the political use that was made in the civil wars of the historical knowledge of conquest, invasion, dispossession, confiscation, etc. Quote, Leviathan's invisible adversary is the conquest. Foucault reads Hobbes as saying that, quote, war or no war, defeat or no defeat, conquest or covenant, it all comes down to the same thing. It's what you wanted. It is you, the subjects, who constituted the sovereignty that represents you. The problem of the conquest is therefore resolved. Page 98. In other words, theoretical knowledge comes to the rescue of the state threatened by the violent history of its own origins. The same relationship between the new disciplinary knowledges and the perennially disruptive discourse of history will be seen in the emergence of nation-states, the spread of colonial empires, and what Foucault calls internal colonialism. Based on my own study of British colonial history, I could give dozens of examples where a theoretically grounded justification of the colonial state, framed within a certain universalist understanding, whether liberal or conservative, of the development of human societies, has attempted to tame the violent history of colonial conquest. Thus, Edmund Burke, conservative critic of the French Revolution, was also a ferocious critic of the despotic misgovernment of the colonial governor Warren Hastings in India, who, he alleged, had scant regard for the ancient dynasties and laws of that civilized country. But when it came to the scandalous history of the British acquisition of Indian territories, the otherwise eloquent Burke was strangely reticent. Quote, many circumstances of this acquisition I pass by, he said in Parliament in 1788. There is a secret veil to be drawn over the beginning of all governments. They had their origins as the beginnings of all such things have had in some matters that had as good be covered by obscurity. And if I were to turn to a liberal, let me give you Thomas Macaulay, the celebrated Whig historian of England, who wrote an essay in 1840 on Robert Clive, the founder of the empire in India. Macaulay could not deny the palpable evidence of the historical records that Clive, in his dealings with Oriental nobles, had descended to the lowest levels of Oriental trickery to secure his victory in battle. But historical judgment, said Macaulay, must be relative. We must judge Clive not as his contemporaries judged him, but by the good consequences we see today as having resulted from his actions. Though still authoritarian and paternal, the state now sat far more lightly, securely, and happily on the people than at any time in India's history. Therefore, suggested Macaulay, one must judge men like Clive with a, quote, more than ordinary measure of indulgence. Finally, if you prefer someone more philosophically rigorous than Macaulay, I could cite none less than Immanuel Kant, who said in his famous essay of 1795 on perpetual peace that although European conquests by war of overseas territories were unjust, the federation of nations must nevertheless accept the historical results of those conquests as naturally given and not attempt to resist them or undo the laws that Europeans had imposed on other peoples. The formation of the disciplines in the 19th century did have their effect on the historical discourse of race struggle. Theoretical knowledge successfully promulgated the truth that the consequences of historical processes were structurally irreversible. Rulers might be changed, yesterday's downtrodden could stand up today and make themselves heard, but certain fundamental institutions produced by actual histories of violence and domination must nonetheless persist. European conquest and settlement of the Americas, the Atlantic slave trade, the primitive accumulation of capital, the dispossession of peasants and artisans, colonial wars, they may all merit the severest moral condemnation, but the structural transformations they have wrought cannot be undone. But if the old races, Normans, Saxons, Gauls, Franks, etc., were no longer the constituent forces of historical struggle, what was the ground on which these fundamental institutions were to be found? Foucault says that from the late 18th and especially the 19th century, there emerged a new subject of history. Quote, "It is what a historian of the period calls a society, but in the sense of an association, group, or body of individuals governed by a statute, a society made up of a certain number of individuals and which has its own manners, customs, and even its own law. The something that begins to speak in history, that speaks of history, and of which history will speak, is what the vocabulary of the day called a nation." This is page 134. In the 18th century, Foucault notes, this society nation carried a sense such that the nobility was thought of as a nation, just as the bourgeoisie was also a nation. But from the 19th century, as we know, the society nation would acquire in Europe a more definite territorialized sense of the identity between people, nation, and state. Foucault says, the earlier idea of nation would give rise in the 19th century to notions like nationality, race, and class. The new subject of history, society, brought about a methodological revolution in history writing. Instead of condemning the brutality or perfidy of the conquering race, historians began to seek the economic and political reasons for defeat. They discovered that instead of the natural equality of citizens as proclaimed by constitutional or juridical theory, what prevailed in actual history was the inequality produced by freedom. Instead of identifying and asserting public rights, therefore, historians began to see their field as the record of the interplay of the relation of social forces. They began to produce knowledge about nations, minorities, classes. In fact, setting aside the juridical construction of the legal subject, the new history produced in the 19th century, now to be called social history, would adopt the state's administrative rationality or governmentality. This word has not yet appeared in the Foucauldian lexicon, to construct its language of the historical analysis of social forces, inventing new methods of survey research and deploying a probabilistic rather than determinist form of scientific reasoning to bring under epistemic control a wide range of social phenomena conditioned by uncertainty. Social history, like the other human sciences, would now fully participate in the process of normalizing society. In his very first lecture of Society Must Be Defended, Foucault points out the stakes involved in our production of knowledge today. Quote, "The question or questions that have to be asked are, what type of knowledge are you trying to disqualify when you say you are a science? What speaking subject, what discursive subject, what subject of experience and knowledge are you trying to minorize when you begin to say, I speak this discourse, I am speaking a scientific discourse, and I am a scientist? What theoretical political vanguard are you trying to put on the throne in order to detach it from all the massive, circulating, and discontinuous forms that knowledge can take?" Page 10, this is the very first lecture. The ostensible target of this charge by Foucault is Marxism. But I think it's a valid question that can be put to virtually all the truths that we proclaim in our universities and learned societies. To take an example, modern medical science tells us that polio vaccination can with complete certainty prevent the occurrence of that disease. But let us say a certain group of people in some remote region decide to refuse vaccination. Their local knowledge of the outside world, gathered through centuries of harsh experience, has taught them not to trust these beneficial gestures offered by city people. The vaccine, they believe, is a plot to harm or kill their children. The community might even suggest that it has a liberal right, supposedly protected by the state, to choose what it thinks is best for its children. Our predicament here is by no means unfamiliar. An authoritarian state might decide to ignore the objections of the community and vaccinate the children by force. After all, scientific truth was on its side. But many of us might not have the stomach for such warlike methods of welfare. Policy scientists and public health experts would then put their heads together to find ways to get around the objections of the parents and devise a subtle system of rewards and penalties to finally elicit their consent. As Foucault tells us, the human sciences are asked to arbitrate on behalf of society between scientific truth and juridical right. The war to defend society is carried out through a humane policy of governmentality. Finally, to bring us back to our immediate context today, let me point out the striking passage in Foucault's lecture of 3rd March 1976, where he talks about the barbarian in relation to civilization. The barbarian, unlike the savage, is a product of history. He can only exist when there is a civilization he can set out to destroy. The barbarian is ruthless and efficient, with excellent skills at fighting wars. He is bad and wicked, but in his arrogance and resolute will to dominate, he has certain qualities that cannot but be admired. I hear Foucault asking us today, doubtless with a large dose of irony, quote, "How can we arrive at the right balance of forces, and how can we make use of the violence, freedom, and so on that the barbarian brings with him? In other words, which of the barbarian's characteristics do we have to retain and which do we have to reject if we are to get a fair constitution to work? What is there in barbarism that we can make use of?" Page 197. Our honest answer might be, we have been doing that for some time now. We have security experts, lawyers, political scientists, entire think tanks, and even university departments figuring out what we must learn from the barbarian's knowledge in order to enhance and fortify our strategies based on nothing else but a thoroughly realist view of national security. And at moments of crisis, we have no dearth of humanists to make impassioned appeals to us to take seriously the threat that the determined and ruthless barbarian poses to our civilized society. But I cannot resist a further twist to this denouement to Foucault's account of the continuation of war in our pacified society. I imagine the picture in reverse of the plotter sitting in Syria or Paris or Brussels, it doesn't matter where, he stands for the most perfect civilization in history, which has been at war for centuries with Western barbarians. For him, the question probably is, what can I learn from the Western barbarian without compromising the identity of my civilization? As I said at the beginning, the stakes that Foucault sets for us in these lectures are extremely high, perhaps impossibly so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Please.
So my comments focus on Foucault's analysis of modern racism and society must be defended. Part one of my remarks explains the how possibly question that motivates Foucault's analysis. And part two explains and evaluates Foucault's answer to that question, giving particular attention to his thesis that modern racism is racism against the abnormal, a thesis that he initially introduces, I believe, in Abnormal. Foucault's analysis of modern racism stems from his observation that the 19th century saw a transformation of the concept of political right. Specifically, that the right to make, live, and let die came to complement, penetrate, and permeate the right to, quote, take life, or let live. For Foucault, this new right, I shall call it the political right of biopower, involves a paradox. On one hand, the function of the modern state, the state in the mode of biopower, is to make live, that is, to enhance life, to improve it. On the other hand, the political right of biopower entitles the state to let die. It seems then that the political right of biopower exceeds and contradicts the function of biopower. Foucault puts the paradox this way: given that this power's objective is essentially to make live, how can it let die? In other words, given that the objective of biopower is to improve life, what explains the legitimation of biopower by appeal to a novel notion of political right that sanctions the state's use of biopower to call for deaths, to demand death? Before considering Foucault's answer to this question, I wish to comment further on the form of the question itself. The question, I suggest, has the form of what philosophers have sometimes called a how possibly or how possible question, a rather nice analysis of which Robert Nozick provides in his book, Philosophical Explanations. Philosophical explanation is a form of philosophy appropriate to answering questions like, how is it possible for us to have free will given that all acts are causally determined? Or, for example, how is it possible that we know anything given that it is logically possible that we are dreaming? As is evident from these examples, the questions that motivate philosophical explanations tend to involve the identification of what Nozick calls apparent excluders. In other words, the questions that motivate these explanations tend to take the following form. How is it possible that such and such is the case, given or supposing a set of considerations that appear to exclude, that is, to rule out the possibility that such and such is the case? In the first of the aforementioned examples, the consideration that all acts are causally determined appears to rule out the possibility that we have free will. In the second of the aforementioned example, the consideration that it is logically possible that we are dreaming appears to rule out the possibility that we know anything. Philosophical explanations tend to answer the how possibly questions that prompt them by attempting to show how is it possible for such and such to be the case, notwithstanding the considerations, that is, the reasons, that appear to rule out that possibility. In the March 17, 1976 lecture, the how possibly question to which Foucault offers a political philosophical explanation is, how is it possible to legitimate or to justify modern state biopower, the modern state and the mode of biopower, by appeal to a political right to call for deaths or to demand death, notwithstanding that the function of modern state biopower is to improve life? In Foucault's view, the consideration that the function of modern state biopower is to improve life appears to exclude or to rule out the possibility of justifying modern state biopower by appeal to a political right to call for deaths or to demand death. The point of the political philosophical explanation and answer that Foucault offers to the how possibly question he poses is to show how it is possible that modern state biopower justifies or legitimates itself by appeal to a political right to call for deaths or to demand death, notwithstanding the consideration that the function of modern state biopower is to improve life. Now, I have another few paragraphs in which I discuss the relationship between Foucault's argument in the pages I'm addressing and an argument that Nietzsche makes in the third essay on the genealogy of morality. And I suggest, very briefly, that Foucault inverts Nietzsche's question. And I can say more about that a bit later, about why I think that is what is going on in the context of Nietzsche's this discussion of priestly asceticism later. But in the interest of time, I will just kind of skip to the next section. So just as it is important to identify the how possibly question that Foucault means to answer with his account of racism, so too is it important to identify the questions and concerns that he is not intending to address. For example, Foucault is not intending to, quote, trace the history of racism in the general and traditional sense of the term, page 87 of the English translation. Neither is he intending to explain what in society he calls ordinary racism, which takes the form of mutual contempt or hatred between the races, or what in abnormal he calls ethnic racism, the prejudice or defense of one group against another. Finally, Foucault is not intending to explain racist scapegoating, what he describes as a sort of ideological operation that allows states or a class to displace the hostility that is directed towards it, or which is tormenting the social body onto a mythical adversary. With these remarks, Foucault no doubt means to distance himself from the Sartre of anti-Semite and Jew, who argue that anti-Semitism is, quote, is a mythical bourgeois representation of the class struggle that sums up all social divisions in the distinction between Jew and non-Jew. So what about Foucault's answer to his how possibly question? Foucault's question, what in fact is racism, which appears on page 254 of the English translation, is, I want to suggest, a shorthand for two distinct questions. The first is, what does modern racism amount to as a doctrine, as a set of claims? And the second is, what functions does this doctrine serve? So what I'm going to suggest is that Foucault has a picture of modern racism, which involves a doctrine, one component of which is a doctrine, and the second component of which is a functional analysis that identifies two functions that doctrine serves. That Foucault is committed to answering the first question, what does modern racism amount to as a doctrine, is already implied in his acknowledgement that racism antedates the modern state's deployment of racism as a mechanism of power. Before the emergence of biopower and before biopower inscribed racism in the mechanisms of the modern state, Foucault tells us that racism, had already been in existence for a very long time, but it functioned elsewhere. This is page 254. The second question is the question that really interests Foucault. For to say what functions doctrinal racism serves, racism understood as a doctrine of claims is what I mean by doctrinal racism. For to say what functions that set of claims serves after the emergence of biopower is precisely to say how its deployment as a mechanism of power effectively answers his how possibly question. Now, considered as a doctrine, Foucault identifies modern racism with, quote, the appearance within the biological continuum of the human race of races, the distinction among races, the hierarchy of races, the fact that certain races are described as good and that others, in contrast, are described as inferior. Now, at this point in his lecture, Foucault is summarizing and moving quickly, but what I take him to be setting forth here is a rather uncontroversial, ideotypical account of Western race thinking, what the philosopher Paul Taylor calls classical racialism, as it had taken shape by the end of the 19th century. Following Taylor, the key tenets of classical racialism include one, that the human race can be exhaustively divided into a few discrete racial subgroups. Two, that each of these subgroups is distinguished by a unique set of heritable and physiological traits, most notably morphological differences in complexion and body shape. Three, that these distinctive sets of physiological traits vary with distinctive sets of moral, cognitive, and cultural characteristics. and formed that the groups or races defined by these clusters of traits can be ranked along graduated scales of worth and capacity. So that's, as it were, the doctrinal content of modern racism that I take Foucault to be summarizing again when he speaks of the appearance within the biological continuum of the human race of races, the distinction among races, the hierarchy of races, and so forth and so on. So racism's first function. Foucault says that racism's first function is to subdivide the human species. Here Foucault is claiming that A, the emergence of biopower corresponds to a distinctive way of describing the human beings addressed by biopower, or and sometimes he says addressed by, or at whom he says biopower is directed, which is to say that biopower addresses human beings not as an aggregate of individuals or individual bodies, but as a species, a global mass that, quote, is affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on. This is pages 242 through 243. And B, that in the wake of the emergence of biopower, the first function of doctrinal racism, or what I've called classical racialism, is to, he says, fragment the human species, or more precisely, to augment the description under which biopower addresses or is directed at human beings by describing them not simply as a species, but additionally as a mixture of subspecies or races into which the species is subdivided by biological type. So the first function, subdivision, treating the human race as a species, and then the argument that biopower addresses the species under description of the species as a collection of subspecies or races. Racism's second function, to justify the state's call for death, for murder, for extermination. Foucault's account of modern racism's second function makes explicit his answer to the how possibly question he has posed. More exactly, Foucault claims that the second function of doctrinal racism is to make possible the justification of modern state biopower by appeal to a political right to demand death, notwithstanding the consideration that the function of modern state biopower is to improve life. Doctrinal racism serves the second function precisely because it is a doctrine on the basis of which the state can justify and make acceptable its murderous actions by appeal to the right to demand death. But justify to whom? Who demands this justification? And this is something I'd be very interested in discussing. It's not quite clear to me what the answer to these questions is. Again, justify to whom? Who demands the justification? Who demands the justification? Is Foucault suggesting that citizens withdraw or would have withdrawn their allegiance to the biopower state were it not able to justify or make acceptable its murderous actions by explaining how these actions improved life? If this is his view, what evidence supports it? In short, doctrinal racism is a doctrine on the basis of which the state can argue that it is entitled to demand the death of some races, of bad and inferior races, because the extermination of those races will make life in general healthier and purer, or in other words, because the extermination of these races will advance the cause of improving life, which again is the function of modern state biopower. It is perhaps obvious that doctrinal racism could not serve its second function without serving its first function, or in other words, that doctrinal racism could not serve its justificatory function unless it were the sort of doctrine that served to fragment the human species by dividing it into distinct races. Thus, racism's first function, no less than its second, plays a critical role in Foucault's philosophical explanation of the legitimation of modern biopower by appeal to a political right to let die. Note finally that Foucault's account of doctrinal racism's second function involves two theses, one weaker than the other. The weak thesis, what I summarize above, is that doctrinal racism suffices to make possible the justification of modern state biopower by appeal to a political right to demand death. The strong thesis is that doctrinal racism is necessary to make possible the justification of modern state biopower by appeal to a political right to demand death. Foucault asserts the strong thesis when he writes that racism is, quote, the indispensable precondition that allows someone to be killed. and that, quote, once the state functions in the biopower mode, racism alone can justify the murderous function of the state. The weak thesis is plausible, the strong thesis less so. With regard to the strong thesis, Foucault neglects to show that there are not other non-racialist ways to conceptualize populations that could be adduced to justify the murderous function of the state in the biopower mode. For example, with regard to the dangers presented by rates of population growth that exceed certain thresholds, the state could select individuals to kill by lot, thus not by race. A further consideration, let me say a few words now about racism's second function. Foucault's account of racism's second function involves the claim that modern racism attains not only when the state undertakes to murder and exterminate the lower and inferior races, but in addition when it undertakes to murder the abnormal or degenerate members of the superior race. As philosopher Liddell McWhorter quite persuasively argues, and I'm referring to her book, her Foucault-inspired book, Racism and Sexual Oppression in Anglo-America, this claim relies on the idea that in addition to the tenets that I identified in Paul Taylor's definition of the doctrinal content of modern racism, that in addition to those tenets, Foucault adds a fifth claim, and this is critical to understanding the notion of racism against the abnormal. That morphological and this is the fifth claim, that morphological and physiological differences between racial types indicate differences in degrees of development, such that inferior races count as inferior because they are less well or imperfectly developed. In Foucault's view, it is but a short step from this fifth tenet to the argument that developmentally deficient or degenerate members of the superior race, imbeciles, criminals, consumptives, masturbators, deaf mutes, epileptics, psychopaths, homosexuals, and Appalachian paupers, should be eliminated for the same reason that it is desirable to eliminate inferior races, namely to make life in general healthier and purer. Thus, if the white, Aryan, or Nordic race is the superior race, then doctrinal races, fifth tenet, doctrinal racism, fifth tenet included, allows modern biopower to argue that it is entitled to demand not only the murder of developmentally deficient non-white races, but in addition the murder of developmentally deficient members of the white race. Racism against the abnormal is what Foucault calls racism directed against the degenerate or the developmentally deficient. A couple of objections. The first objection is that Foucault's account of modern racism is too narrow, for it fails to acknowledge other functions that racism can serve. To be sure, and quoted this passage, to be sure, Foucault remarks that when he speaks of killing, he means to include every form of indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on. That said, we may still worry that Foucault's answer to the question, what in fact is racism, overlooks some of the functions that doctrinal racism, or again, classical racialism, served. In other words, we may accept that doctrinal racism fragments the species, and that in so doing it also makes possible the justification of state biopower by appeal to a right to demand death, yet still wish to take note of the other justificatory functions it has served during the 19th and 20th centuries. For example, just one example, the function of justifying chattel slavery, actually two examples, and as the Du Bois of Dusk of Dawn, the Sartre of Critique of Dialectical Reason, and many others have noted the function of justifying colonial economic exploitation. Foucault is certainly right to note that colonialism involved genocide, but that is not all it involved. So, first objection, that the account is too narrow. The second is that the account is, in a different way, too broad. It is too broad, for it loses sight of the historical, sociological, and ideological specificity of each of the different modes of oppression that Foucault comprehends under the notion of racism against the abnormal. Taking account of the multidimensional specificities of modern anti-Semitism, modern anti-Black racism, modern anti-Arab racism, and modern anti-Arab racism, not to mention sexuality and gender-based oppressions, or the intersection between different kinds of oppression, is likely to argue against the thesis that all these phenomena always or even typically satisfy the notion of racism against the abnormal. I conclude with a conjecture that Foucault's analysis is at once too narrow and too broad because he tends to equate Nazi racism with modern racism as such. The thought here is that Foucault's central example drives his argument, leading him to, then that often happens with philosophers, leading him to underestimate the functional scope of doctrinal racism and to overestimate the extension of the concept of racism against the abnormal.
Thank you, Robert Bernard. Okay, so I'm going to try and give some structure to our seminar. The truly insightful comments by Ann Stoler, Partha Chatterjee, and Bob Gooding-Williams raise four important themes. The first is the place of history and truth in Foucault's discussion of the discourse of race wars. The second is the place of colonialism as a pivot moment in Foucault's analysis. The third is the functions of modern racism in the mechanisms of biopower. And the fourth, I think, is the relevance of Foucault's 1976 lectures to the recent global acts of violence. So I'll start with the first theme, which I would call history and truth. Now, this was raised most directly in Partha's comments, and it connects this course very well to the earlier courses in the series. In terms of the trajectory of the lecture series, many commentators identified in the first few lectures, 1971, 72, 73, the project of writing a history of truth. Many people have referred to that, and what the publication of these lectures had given us is this idea that maybe there was this project to write a history of truth. Now, this organizing thread was somewhat less prominent, I would say, in the 1974 and 1975 lectures, but I think it returns here vividly. Whereas earlier, Foucault had been addressing truth and juridical forms, right, which was the title of the Rio lectures from 73, here Foucault is squarely in the realm of truth and historical forms. Now, Partha captures this brilliantly in his analysis of Foucault's argument that the historiography of race wars erupts in the 17th century. This is in the lectures at pages 57 to 62. And it erupts with what Foucault refers to as a historical political discourse or a counter-history on page 70 to the earlier, to be somewhat simplistic, Roman history and philosophical juridical discourse. So it represents one new historical form. And as Partha suggests, these histories of the race wars do not claim any universal truth. This is the relationship that is peculiar. This is the new and peculiar relationship to truth that's represented by these histories. Truth is decentered, as Foucault explains on page 52. I personally here think of the birth of realist political discourse in international relations, for instance, a decentering from universality, where being biased or having particular interests, national interests, is the guardian, in some sense, of truth. And I think Foucault's discussion of that around pages 52, 54 is particularly interesting. Now, this leads to what Foucault refers to at the top of page 54 as a truth weapon, right? History as a truth weapon. He writes about it as a truth bound up with a relationship of force, a truth weapon, and a singular right. Or on page 57, it is a discourse, on the bottom, it is a discourse in which truth functions exclusively as a weapon that is used to win an exclusively partisan victory. Now, later, historically, it will be elided, as Partha suggests, with the discourse of perpetual peace, in Kant's terms, and the whitewashing of the warlike social relations with the advent of the human sciences and the universalism of post-revolution, post-French Revolution. Now, the genealogy of this historical political discourse intersects with Marx directly, as Foucault draws the connection between race war and class war that Marx had mentioned in his letter to Joseph Wedemeyer of March 5th, 1852. But Partha adds that it's not just the relationship to Marx, it also raises questions about all the truths that we proclaim in our universities and learned societies. So one theme is this relationship to historical forms, or more generally, what I would call truth and academic forms, right? Because obviously it's not limited to just history. And we can ask in our own work whether we escape this, whether we even try, or whether it's part of our mission. How do we as historians in this room, political scientists, legal scholars, anthropologists, philosophers, etc., reflect, or self-reflectively, as we were asked to do by Anne, on this question of truth in academic forms. Okay, the second theme is the relationship to colonialism. Anne Stoler asks us in her insightful comments, first, why Foucault had not turned to European imperial formations to explore state racism, and second, why Foucault had not turned to France, to the France of the time, though little different than today, with its problems of distressed urban outskirts and, or today we would say, les banlieues. Now here I would suggest that Foucault offers, in his own words, ideas, schemas, outlines, and he does so with regard to the place of colonialism. So I would turn the question back to Anne and ask, not why did he not develop them more, but what can we make of what he does propose? So in the first place, in the fourth lecture on January 28, 76, this is on page 65, Foucault argues here that the discourse of race war and of race struggle, which was our first theme, is reworked in the 19th century into a racist discourse for purposes, he states, of social conservation and, at least in a certain number of cases, colonial domination. So a central purpose of the reworking and of the merging in, or the morphing from class war to racism, to a form of racism, is, according to Foucault here, for the purpose of colonial domination. Now, in the next lecture, on February 4th, 1976, and here on page 103, Foucault adds another layer and explores what he calls, and what Anne mentioned, about the boomerang effect of colonial practice. The way in which these practices of colonial domination would revert back to the domestic in the West. What he argues is that the same practices that the Western nations would export to the colonies would return to the domestic governing mechanisms of the colonizers. And he writes on page 103, a whole series of colonial models was brought back to the West, and the result was that the West could practice something resembling colonization or an internal colonialism on itself. So here the suggestion is that we could either look to colonial domination or colonization or domestic colonization, or as the model. Well, let's say we could either look to colonial domination as the model for the birth and function of modern racism, or one could look at the domestic boomerang illustrations, which I take it would involve the focus on HLMs that we were mentioning, but also generalized policing today, such as the kinds of practices that are being most vehemently contested by the Black Lives Matters movement. Then, after tracing the history of the race war, which was of particular interest to him, he returns to the colonial experience to discuss racism in the lecture of the March 17th, 1976, where he, and so now I'm on page 257, where he suggests that, of course, a real way of thinking about the relations, that this offers a real way of thinking about the relations between colonization, the necessity for wars, criminality, the phenomena of madness and mental illness, the history of society with their different classes, and so on. And then he mentions in the next paragraph, racism first develops with colonization, or in other words, with colonizing genocide. Okay, now it's at that point that he then turns, of course, to Nazism, or on page 259, as one example of the most murderous states. But I take it by implication, Nazism stands in for other forms of genocide, one of which being, or a central one of which being, colonizing genocide, which kind of triggers the analysis. As an aside, I think we might also ask ourselves whether this is a place where Foucault is dealing with what we had referred to in a few previous seminars as the kind of, what was it, brute violence, right? Or extreme violence or pure violence. And that the analysis that he's giving here in terms of the morphing from race wars and the introduction of racism and the functions of racism would be his analysis of extreme brute violence. I think that was a topic that Alondra Nelson had put on the table. But in any event, so the question here would be whether these schemas and ideas are productive, misguided. Is it right that it originates with, or as it has as its purpose, colonization? Or that one can replace colonization with the boomerang effect, say, or that it's related to genocide, colonizing genocide. Okay, the third theme is modern racism. So Bob Gooding-Williams draws our attention forward to modern racism, which is discussed most poignantly by Foucault in, I think, 3 passages, pages 60 to 62, 81 to 84, and 254 to 263. Now, this is the modern racism whose function is so dark. It's not just ethnic racism, which, Lord knows, can be murderous, as we see and as we are seeing today, particularly with police shootings. Query, Bob, incidentally, would that be ethnic racism or modern racism at play? And what would be the relationship between the two there? But in any event, it's not just ordinary racism, he tells us on page 258. It is more penetrating because it justifies and legitimates the death drive of biopolitics, the let die euphemism, the right to kill that is wedded to the making of life. It is what justifies the elimination of the abnormal, the degenerate, as a means to enhance the lives of the superior species beings. And in fact, as Foucault argues, it justifies the most murderous of all racist states, Nazism, page 259, and earlier Soviet state racism on page 83. Now here I would like to encourage discussion on this third theme of modern racism in general, but raise one issue. Bob, you suggested that Foucault's account of modern racism is both too narrow and too broad. Too narrow because it fails to acknowledge other functions that racism served, you suggested. Now, when I listened to the alternative functions, though, that you suggested, which were justifying chattel slavery or justifying colonial economic exploitation, I heard less a new function than another form of indirect murder. Now, so indirect murder is a key, is key here. You mentioned it and mentioned it. It's not just killing that Foucault is interested in, or that biopolitics does. It's every form of indirect murder. Exposing someone to death, he says, increasing the risk of death for some people. And this is very important. This is very important because it leads, of course, into American neoliberalism, or at least the analysis of neoliberalism that he's going to give in 1979. This kind of this economic appreciation of the value of life and in all of its different measures. But I wonder if the problem is here that Foucault didn't flesh out indirect murder sufficiently and place slavery or economic subservience in that list, or that he didn't provide the right functions. And so I would want to kind of separate the two. The larger question, of course, is whether we buy his account of the functions of modern racism in the biopolitical power that is best described, of course, as the right to make, live, and let die. And I think this is, again, very important because I believe that this element is at the root of the critique of American neoliberalism that he will develop in Birth of Biopolitics in the lectures of March 21st, 1979. So it's a theme that we'll be returning to as well. The fourth theme is the implication for today's acts of violence. Both Anne Stoler and Partha Chatterjee invoke society must be defended as a useful lens to our current political situation. Anne points our attention to the ritualized responses and blowback to the Paris attacks, seeing there a vivid illustration of Foucault's insight about the intensely racialized qualities of the biopolitical modern state. Now, earlier I had mentioned realism in international relations in the context of a truth weapon, and it's this kind of realist discourse, I think, as well that is dominant today. And in fact, I see it reflected well in Partha's comments, where he discusses security experts with their, quote, thoroughly realist view of the national interest. And so one might ask to what extent a truth weapon such as realism functions in today's debates. For his part, Partha adds a final twist to the conversation, imagining one of the plotters asking him or herself, "What can I learn from the Western barbarian without compromising the identity of my civilization?" This is naturally a pregnant question or formulation, so much so that maybe it may be impossible for us to resolve. I take that to be the point. The stakes of these lectures, Partha tells us, may be impossibly high. If we agree that the stakes may be impossibly high, though, then perhaps there's no way out of this race war against barbarians from both sides. I wonder whether we want to leave it there, and so I want to open discussion on the fourth theme as well, to the audience and to Partha before, well, perhaps to the audience before returning to our guests.
Yes.
Now, without being too much of a disciplinarian, I wonder if we might try to structure the conversation in the seminar, or at least identify our comments and questions along the lines of these four themes.
Thank you, Bernard.
You're welcome.
And please, let's Jeremy, Akil, Adam.
So this is a question or proposal that I think is related to the first theme, as you identified it, which is Foucault's reconstruction of race war as a kind of model of history. But then I think something goes on there in some of the pages Bernard you identified that I think helps to explain maybe the puzzles of particularly of racism, of the way Foucault defines racism at the end. And that is, there really does seem to be an inversion that goes on between page 80-81, where Foucault identifies the construction of modern racism or biological racism as an anti-revolutionary discourse, as precisely produced at the moment when race war was being mobilized as just specifically a revolutionary discourse, he says. That's in the early 19th century. So it's a reaction, an attempt to suppress the transformation of race war into a popular tactic. But then, in the last two lectures, when we get the history of the French Revolution and Thierry, all of a sudden, it is that mode of the people who are promulgating modern racism are absolutely identified, right, with the victors of the French Revolution, with the bourgeois state. They're not, and he explicitly distinguishes them from what he says will be the rightist and the reactionary critiques going forward of this sort of bourgeois vision of totalization. Something very puzzling has gone on, where he is simply inverted, or it seems as though he has inverted the relationship between racism and revolution. Whereas early on, racism is used to put down, to crush the kind of the idea.
Well, it's not that he's inverted it, I wonder, Jeremy, if that is actually the genealogical move, is that that reversibility is intrinsic, in a sense, to how he sees that. It's a constant constant reversibility of that. That's always a possibility. That's always a preserved possibility that it can be.
I think that's right. It's always a possibility. Although he does not self-consciously address the fact that, because he's talking about the same moment of history on page 80 and at the end. And on page 80, he has right and left aligned, the right with racism. And then at the end, he doesn't have the left aligned with racism, but he has the bourgeoisie. And so I just wanted to suggest that I think one of the reasons for perhaps the narrowing or the insufficiency of the concept of racism that Foucault is putting forward as the sole justification for the murderousness of the modern state is the disappearance, the mysterious disappearance of class struggle as one form of the race war, right? And that's clearly the form of race war that he's talking about on page 80 and 81. Class struggle disappears. I think Foucault silently folds it in to his general critique of economism that he identifies with the bourgeois victors who create the modern state, right? He says they create the dialectic, and they create the dialectic based on this totalization of the state through their understanding of the economy as the basis for their legitimacy. That's the story he gives about the bourgeois victors who create the modern state. And I think he just sort of folds class struggle in as, we know that class struggle is just another one of those economisms. But once you remove, to me, it would be it is what class struggle gets at, right, is I think perhaps what Robert was getting at in the example of, say, chattel slavery, is the problem that the modern state has to use the power of death, not just to get rid of the abnormal, but to get more productivity out of people for the purposes of the productive state, right? It is, so it's like, as one example of like other kinds of populations that the modern state kills in the 20th century, it's, and that it uses to justify killing, is leftists, right? Is communists, Germany in 1919. And it's precisely because there's this relationship, direct relationship between the productivity of the state, right? Its need to use workers, and the killing of them. That is to me sort of like central to the problem of the modern state. And it's very hard to explain that without class struggle.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to bring together something that Bob said and something that Partha said. So Partha asked the question about how much we professors or intellectuals who shape normalization at a level of intellectual discourse and align ourselves with power, we need to really understand power in a very subtle sense. And in order to get to that, I wanted to give an example of what Bob called the abnormal, right? Finding the abnormal. So take the fact that in The Nation, even in a magazine like The Nation, after the 2004 election, there was a piece which said of the heartland, which voted for Bush in large numbers, these people are violent stupid. They're violent stupid. They're unredeemably violent stupid is the phrase, right? Of violent stupid. So 50% of the country is abnormal, is violent stupid by the normalizations that we intellectuals, metropolitan intellectuals have come to. It's finding an abnormal in our midst. And yet, the normalization here is aligned not to the actually existing powers, right? It's because, in fact, Bush won that, or whatever happened, I don't know what happened in that election, but Bush came to power. So it isn't aligned to power in some obvious sense, right? So it's aligned to something else. And this is to trace it back to people like Kant and so on, because those are the values and norms and so on. And so it's power in a much more diffuse sense. It's not immediate power. So does that count as a case of abnormal? Is this a way in which an intellectual class can define an abnormal and treat literally half the country as abnormal by the lights off, the norms that have been set up? And so I'm just curious about relating what Partha said about the intellectual class falling into this, and your remark about it.
Just a very brief suggestion that we take extremely seriously Bernard's first point, right? That in this lecture series, which he starts by saying is a kind of restart, right? That he feels like a beached whale, that he has to get back in motion. And what does he do? Exactly as you were saying, he goes back to this question of the history of truth, how we write a non-philosophical, how we give a non-philosophical account of the origins of truth. And what really struck me was the stakes, and I think we just can't underestimate the stakes to take up another one of Partha's points, because in that first lecture, the awesome first fragments, his target, or his zone in which he's operating, is classical Greece, and the aim of the game is to show, as it were, how a truth regime could emerge from what he calls an aborted land war. Right? And to me, the bit that really rocked me back in this is where he derives Hegel from an effort to smooth out this underlying race war. So, as it were, the next big, or maybe the third big move in Western thought, which is going to be the prized possession of philosophy from that moment onwards, that's going to found Marx, is here again described and positioned as well, everyone knows the passage. It's on page 58. Basically, the dialectic codifies struggle, war, and confrontations. It turns them into the twofold process. The dialectic finally ensures the historical constitution of the universal subject. The Hegelian dialectic and all those that came after it must, I think, and as I will try to demonstrate to you, be understood as philosophy and rights colonisation and authoritarian colonisation. The historical politico discourse that was both a statement of fact, a proclamation, and a practice of social war. Right? This is, I think, to me, this is, as it were, precisely the resumption of that high-stakes game of taking all of philosophy and giving an account of it that is not philosophical. And instead, then his own call on page, this remarkable bit that Anne picked out on 173, where he gives this account of history's total imbrication with war. And then his appeal, it's very difficult to contemplate in the late 1960s, so I think this is also a total revisiting of the order of things. But we must try to be historicists. Amongst all of the things, the appalling things he's summoning us to. He says that. We must try to be historicists. In other words, try to analyse this perpetual and unavoidable relationship. Right? So that is not Marx, so not, as it were, past Hegel by way of Marx, but back before Hegel and Marx by way of this sort of radical historicism, which then leaves, as everyone is saying, basically everything in suspense, because how do you know which side of this conflict you're going to be on? Are you with the guys in Brussels, or are you with us hunting them down? And there's this... Anyway, but I do think that is, for me, architecturally, and I think it runs through to the lectures that Anne was also pulling back into these, the ones after the break.
Anne, can I say one more quote to that, which I think is on 237, where I think you could understand his historicism versus the history that he then is going to associate with Marxism and post-Hegelian thought. This is the very end of the 10th of March lecture, 237, and he's talking about the self-dialecticalization that the bourgeoisie engaged in, and he writes, from the 19th century onward, something new began to happen. History and philosophy began to ask the same question. What is it in the present that is the agent of the universal? What is it in the present that is the truth of the universal? That is the question asked by history. It is also the question asked by philosophy. The dialectic is born. So clearly that is so he is saying, and that's why in the first lecture he's talking about counter-history. So this is the history he opposes and he associates it in the first lecture, among other things, with Marxist science. With science.
With science.
No, and
Yeah.
Let's open.
Look up.
So, but I think this is an interesting point. Trying to go back before Hegel, but also before Marx here, it's not just a critique. I think a critique of Marxism is clear here. He seems to have passed in a discontinuous or some sort of way, I don't know, from the 71, 72, 72, 73 lectures, which is a contre Marxism, which is where he's using the prism of a civil war, but really the prism of reading history through a kind of antagonistic social or political ontology, and now he's passed to the genealogy of that ontology. So it's an auto-critique, but it's also an auto-critique that is very implicated in, I think, contemporary politics. And so one question isn't just where are these lacunae coming from, but where's the kind of plenitude or the positivity of his discourse, which ends in a very classical kind of anti-totalitarian kind of language. On the one hand, we have, the state racism of the Nazis. On the other hand, you have the, state racism of the USSR. And this is happening in 1976, and so I think it's very useful to at least have that in mind and to sort of track it in terms of the conventional political discussion that's going on in France at a moment when you're passing into this kind of anti-totalitarian moment. And he's doing it in a much more artful way than his contemporaries, I think, but he's still performing that kind of transition, and it implies a kind of turning back. There's a recursive movement, but it's a kind of denegation of what he's doing. And there's actually explicit moments where he says, I've been doing this, I think it's, c'est fini, so there's this kind of, there's this real recursiveness to it. But the question is whether then he doesn't fall into this very classic, I'm reading the stuff he has to say about first imperialism, then the USSR and the Nazis, it reads kind of like, you might think, what maybe we need to set him in context with Arendt or someone like that. This is really the question of kind of trying to figure out what the political context is. But what happens when you jettison that kind of antagonistic social ontology? He seems to fall into another kind of very conventional way of telling the story, even if it's marked by his own kind of style. But there's some very conventional kind of turning points here.
Yeah.
Jean.
Well, it's a perfect segue to what I was going to say, because I was going to mention, what I was going to do, I was going to do it a little subtly, but the cat's out of the bag. So I was going to ask what is this boomerang? I want to look at that. Because the boomerang effect, I don't know how to say this without being sounding absurd, means that something's booming back. In other words, the boomerang of the colonial stuff. Now, of course, that's in Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, 1951. Exactly. The sectional imperialism. Yeah. But the point is that for her, and also for some of those who were trying to get into decolonize themselves, in the colonies, the problem was, or a problem was, those methods of the discretionary state, arbitrariness, decree laws, police unconstrained, surveillance, crowd control, all those methods, right? That's what was going to boomerang back, which implies that it was different in some way, somewhere else. Yes. And I'm interested in how Foucault or Foucauldian could articulate that difference. Because if it's all that stuff, then it's, how do you choose between Brussels and, I don't know. But anyway, forget about that. But if it's all, it's all governance and or governmentality and those mechanisms, what's boomeranging into what, if you see what I'm saying? Now, for Arendt, it's not hard to answer that. Not that she's naive. She might have had many problems, but not that. But, she had those expressions, but not only her, also the people who were pushing against the decree law kind of stuff. She said things like rule of law and don't pounce. I'm just saying what she said, and some other forms of being governed that are different from what would boomerang back. So again, it's not to say that things are just cool in the what do you call it? The mother, what's it called? The
Metropole.
Metropole. Thanks. That's not the point. But I'd still like to understand what the boomerang thing is about.
Rosalind?
I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing or not, Jean. I mean, there's this phrase, lecture de savoir, that introduces the first chapters. It's interesting vis-a-vis the question you put on the table, because when Foucault opens this with that first lecture and he pays such homage to Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, from which we get the trinity of savages, barbarians, and civilized men, he makes two arguments. The first is, to describe the anti-psychiatry movement and others as sort of critiques of totalitarian knowledge, and the other is to make this interesting claim that was possible by virtue of re-accessing or historical contents, right? What is it? It was certainly not a semiology of life in the asylum or a sociology of delinquents that made an effective critique of the asylum or the prison possible. It really was the appearance of historical contents. And this speaks to this kind of what you're describing as this return to historicism. But it seems to me that there's a discontinuity that Foucault is holding on between historical knowledge and other human sciences. So one might want to sort of on ethical grounds say, all of us academics, but I think he's making a very specific claim for historical knowledge as opposed to those forms of systematizing knowledges which are of the order of the institutions of regularization that subtend the regulatory as opposed to the disciplinary regime, and that kind of last insistence on that distinction is important. And the reason I say that is because part of what you were describing in that, for me, I'm sure for the political scientists this is old hat, but for me, political theorists, and maybe even political scientists, I don't know, but political theorists who read Hobbes better than me, it's quite an amazing reading of Hobbes, I think, in his insistence that Hobbes is confronted with the problem of insufficient difference. And that the problem of insufficient difference is the only way to understand a war of all against all, and that this somehow is transformed by historical knowledge of the conquest, which allows for the first formation of groups, the conquerors and the conquered, and that the repression of that first grouping is what, if one can use that word, probably not, but anyways, the covering over of that first grouping gets increasingly performed via forms of racialization, that this becomes the alternative. And so if that first grouping operates on the basis of power contract, the second one takes the question over, doesn't relinquish the question of consent, you quoted this, I rule because you want me to. And that seems to me a kind of devastating question to live with, and it certainly struck me as the question that needs to be asked vis-a-vis American war-making practice. You want to be liberated, so we will do it for you. That was the shock, the endlessly repeated shock in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it leads us, I think, to want to hold open a possible distinction between historical knowledges which can be made to return and do a critical function vis-a-vis human science knowledges, which are working somewhat differently vis-a-vis the regulatory rather than the disciplinary.
What's funny is
in a way that's what genealogy is that possibility of those arrested histories and those suspended histories that are the preserved possibility of other political futures. That's what genealogy is designed in some sense to do. But the thing is, it doesn't only do that. It can go in all kinds of other directions that are far more nefarious than just this sort of liberatory story that he kind of tells of it in genealogy in the essay from 71.
Nadia and Stathis.
Just a small considerations following Jean. Question concerning the boomerang. Meaning, he has these two registers. On the one hand, this binary logic, the binary of the race that race implies, one against the other, the power against the minority or any kind of. On the other hand, his criticism of dialectics. So, but if you have these two alternatives, either dialectic or the binary, I really ask the question again that Jean asked concerning the boomerang. What does it mean that they will react against us, or they colonized against the colonizer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I really would like to understand in which way this operates within the reality of the colonizer, I mean.
Yeah. Can I quickly?
I'm not in charge.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Just can I just?
Yeah.
So these are totally, I think, wonderful questions, and in some ways, it's what about the boomerang that. It is, in a way, what critical colonial studies has been doing for 25 years.
What's critical? Oh, right.
No, I mean, that's not to meant
that.
snidely at all. But the notion that there is a sort of analytic domain that is metropolitan colony that has to be treated together, that it's not just that the colonies were laboratories of modernity as once imagined to be, but that there's circulation of techniques, of surveillance forms. Gorgeous book by Al McCoy on the way in which Filipino surveillance techniques were being used in the U.S. But it's so much of colonial studies is actually engaging at that lower level, not at a global, here's the colony and here's the metropole, but at the level of techniques. So if we look at something like Maître, that was a colonie agricole, for abandoned kids outside in northern France. That very form gets adopted in Java. It gets used in Algeria. It's turned around, and what happens in Algeria actually reshapes how these colonies agricoles are being used. There are so many intricacies of the ways in which this matrix works, and it takes us right back to Bernard's question about, well, what does the colonial offer, or what does this offer the colonial? The entire mapping of the techniques is entirely skewed. And, each of the quotes, with all due respect, my dearest, all of the quotes on, I've used in the 1995 book, every single place where he goes to the colony. He doesn't do anything with it. He offers it. He doesn't take us there. It's there, but if we believe that there's some effect to historical knowledge, the fact that he never takes us there, that what gets adopted in colonial studies is such a functionalist, this discipline functions for colonial domination. It's like he never does the work for us that lets us the way he does it in terms of Europe. And it matters a lot. It's just not that, we don't have it. It's that the entire landscape of the way in which academic knowledge around these issues was crafted out really didn't get to some of these, the nature of that return effect and how many levels and registers it operates. And you know what? We still haven't done it.
Okay. Stathis and then Alex. No, why? No, it's fantastic. And in any case, some of these questions also were taken over by some of the people who were in the actual seminars, like Serge Wyszynski and other people who were working on this boomerang effect.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to return to the question of historicism and dialectics in light of Anne's very important methodological point about genealogy, which I want to highlight. But given the thread of the conversation, I wanted to say just one simple comment about the point of the critique of Hobbes, or the reading of Hobbes in the notion of war. As I mentioned in the seminar on the punitive society, Foucault's concept of war, or the civil war or race war, in relation to Hobbes, is influenced immensely by the work of Pierre Clastre, which is, at this particular point, the event that lands in French thinking. So in page 90, which is essentially the part that Ross highlighted, the phrase is very simply, First, what is this war that exists before the state, in which the state is in theory destined to end? This is Glasser's question. The matter of insufficient differences, or the fact that war, instead of separating societies, actually unifies societies, is really Glasser's point. So I think that with that discussion, it would be interesting to think in those terms. Now, the methodological point, I think, is very important. I think that we might want to sort of divest ourselves, perhaps, or temper our investment in the critique of dialectics. Even when Foucault triumphantly announces it. Because if we're going to take seriously Anne's point, and I think we should, the thing about the understanding of genealogy and the fact that, let's say, as we move through the different kinds of formation or epistemes, I used to call them in the Les Mots les Choses, and we do not see them as sequential, as some kind of sort of sequential parataxis of formations, but we actually see them as, and this is what I think he's suggesting all along, see them as entwined sort of situations where things emerge from one into the other, and where in fact the notion of the new can never be understood to erase the old, or in fact the new is what makes the old understandable as old, but only insofar as it is part of that kind of formation. Then I think a critique of dialectics is kind of perhaps not so worthy of investment. At least this is really how I would see it, and I think this would give us even more, let's say, I don't know, it gives more weight to the notion of discontinuity, which is really, I mean, it is one of his great contributions.
Yes.
And so that the fact that then things can emerge, archaic things can emerge as present. Yes, they definitely emerge as present. They're totally present. That's not a problem, because they are in that sense absorbed, even if tampered with and changed by the new formation and so on and so forth.
Alex?
Without
but respectfully, I mean, in the text, Foucault simply says, what I'm doing this year from now on for the rest of my life is rejecting the theory of discontinuity, because the theory of discontinuity is insufficient, and genealogy is insufficient to the extent that it has been founded up to this point, even in my own thought, on economy. And he turns to war precisely because he needs something that is not discontinuous, but is also not based on a theory of economic continuity. And both, to me, like, that's very hard to run away from.
All right, that is just, and very shortly.
It's always been the same. Discontinuity was never meant, gaps between formations.
That's right.
And we have to, authors say whatever they say. We don't take them at their word. I mean, the fact that he says whatever he says needs to be, of course, deconstructed. And if we look at the work, we can see that that's the case. I mean, he announces these things. He announces several times that he changes his position and so on. Anyway.
I don't want to interrupt this honorable civil war going on. I think Luca actually wants to follow up on that thread. I'll retake, because my thematic is slightly obliquely turning into a conversation that started here on this side. So Luca, if you wanted to.
Oh, yes,
yeah, okay. Just briefly. So the question of what he's doing is interesting, because on the one hand, it seems like he's like, we'll pass beyond, theoretical discourses. On the other side, he seems to be saying that there's no way of doing that. In fact, that his game is really to kind of try to marry some sort of genealogical project with the fragments of existing theories. And I think in 7, this is really clear. I'm going to try to translate it into French, but into English from French. 7 in the French, he says, it's not that the enveloping and global theories haven't furnished and don't continue to furnish in a really constant manner the locally usable instruments. Marxism and psychoanalysis are precisely there to prove it, but they do it, on the condition precisely that the theoretical unity of the discourse is suspended, cut up, etc., etc. And you see him doing that really especially in the early methodological stuff, which he doesn't seem to follow up on, but precisely on this concept of assujettissement, on the production of subjects, this is somewhere where you can see that he's pulling out of contemporary Marxism elements, he's economizing them, he's trying to reintegrate them back into his genealogical method. On the other hand, it seems like it's kind of a conventional theory, or history of discourses. I mean, as a text. Okay.
I know that you want to continue with this discussion, and I encourage you to write about it and send it to the blog if you want, but we need to take 2 more comments and then wrap up.
And then return to it.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, that's
so Alex and
it's
Nenny.
like the engagement, but okay, fine. Just wanted to introduce a new thematic connecting it directly to your first question, which is the role of truth in history. Talk a little bit about that beginning opening passage, and perhaps reconcile it with this idea of the boomerang. Very shortly, I've been engaged in these debates with my dear friend, Professor Dennis Tenner from the English department, about whether one should be a mediator or not, and whether the mediator is actually just perpetuating civil war, and at some points you should just like let them go their separate ways, and but this is always there, and this idea of the civil war that he started us off with his early lectures kind of seems to come to a head here with total war, right? And it's when we talk about like this kind of boomerang and this ignoring the plantation society as the model for a lot of these power techniques. I mean,
right.
Which Marxists have been pointing out way before
of industrialization.
Yeah, I mean, ignoring their own tradition of anti-colonial thinking coming right there in Paris. And Mrs. There was a critical colonial theorist, and in 1949 he already said, "There's a boomerang, and it's coming to hurt you." And Nazism is nothing more than these other techniques, these other things you learn how to do over there, right? So all of these things are there, but he's ignoring it, and I think it's because he's trying to, or I mean, I don't want to justify him, but I think he's trying to actually hold on to that difference between civil, which is the history I'm going to trace here, the history of my people, almost critical white studies here a little bit, and this other side, which I'm going to go ahead and leave completely as war, and the other side. And it's attention because he tries to bring in that total war. I know it sounds paradoxical, but it's attention because he tries to bring in that total war to the internal European. Imagine the internal European. I still don't have a way to get out of that bind, of that separation from something that was part of Europe already as the contaminant for years, and this kind of attempt to create a civil space around which the Saxons and the Anglos can work. So that links it back to the thematic that I will introduce and probably reinforce once in a while as I jump in for the rest of the thing, which is that original moment when he starts this, talking about microphones and about how the word does get out. The truth in history, it does get out somehow, almost mysteriously, but it does get out through media, right? Through microphones and the printing of books and these kinds of things, which he ignores throughout and the lectures. And this is where I think the audience that he's talking to is one in which one could actually make these arguments about civil war. And that the truth that does get out, those mechanisms of this particular lecture won't reach the larger civil war that we're engaged in, which is the global war.
It's very Western.
The West, yeah. So that's it. We'll return to the material conditions of the spread of truth and historical knowledge later. Go ahead.
Very briefly, Nenny, and then we need to.
Okay, very quickly. So this is a very good point that Alex just made, because I think that it actually brings together in perhaps really non-intuitive ways the two questions that have been coming up. And one is, of course, civil war, and the other one is the question of discontinuity. So what do we understand as discontinuity in Foucault, I think, is the question that needs to be asked. And I think that discontinuity is precisely what defines civil war, right? I mean, it is precisely what separates total war as something which exists out there into producing a discontinuity between the understanding of the continuity of the nation, or the continuity of the race, or the continuity of the political, through a constructed discontinuity, which is always ad hoc, right? So there is, and I know that some of you know that I've written about this zone of danger that's this gray zone of danger that gets constituted which is precisely the zone of danger that Foucault, I think, is alluding to. And that gets constantly inhabited by different subjects, different subjectivities, which always get constituted as being either continuous and then suddenly in a syncope, right? They get constituted as discontinuous, right? So I think that the question of the Civil War is the question of the discontinuity that needs to be brought in.
Thank you very much. So let's wrap up with your interventions and Partha and
well, I talk, so you don't.
Well, so just to respond to a few of the remarks. Indirect murder, which I think related, there was a relationship between the question you raised with respect to indirect murder and I think the question that Jeremy asked. I guess I don't find the concept of indirect murder to be very helpful. I mean, just because the argument is very specific. It's about justifying the murder of subspecies, and I have the impression when I get to that passage that Foucault said, this isn't quite going to do the work I wanted to do. In order to do the work that I wanted to do, I need to have a more expansive conception of murder, and so I add under the category of murder all sorts of things that literally don't count as murder, and then invent the phrase indirect murder. I think it's more helpful to distinguish between murder and slavery, different modes of economic exploitation, and so forth. And so I think introducing mention of indirect murder does works more to obscure than to illuminate. I wanted to speak to the point that Akil made about the Nation article, and I do think that I don't recall the article, but I do think there's a kind of developmentalism in the rhetoric, and I think that developmentalism, the suggestion is they're immature, we're mature. I mean, but developmentalism doesn't always play out in terms of the categories of 19th century classical racialism. So yes, there is some notion of the abnormal, maybe a notion of purification. I'm not sure of maybe there's an ideal of purity at work there, but it's not clear to me that if there is a notion of an ideal purity implicit in those remarks, that it's involves the idea of a biologically pure race. So regarding the remarks having to do with continuity and Hegel and dialectics, I mean, I very much agree with what I think Stavis was saying.
Well, several points. I'll be very quick. First, Jeremy, this question about the sort of racism, which is anti-revolution, right, which is the earlier moment. Now that, of course, Foucault is referring to largely these aristocratic, reactionary aristocrats, right, in relation to something that's happening when you come to Thierry, and the idea of society is already emerged there in the second case, right? So it seems to me what Foucault is suggesting there is in fact the idea of race, which is earlier in the old sense of race struggle, right? Where the aristocrats are a race, the nobility is a race, the bourgeoisie is a race. Whereas now, when you get to the early 19th century, you get the first moments of the social history emerging. The questions are very different, right? And that, I think, is the transition that he's indicating. So, in fact, there is the term, the idea of race in the two cases clearly would be already there's a transition. Akil's argument, you see, I think here when one understands norm or normal, I think Ian Hacking explicates this very well in arguing that there are two senses of the norm that emerge through the 19th century. One is purely a statistical idea, right, of norm as normal, average, or whatever it is. In which sense, of course, when you categorize the majority of the people as abnormal, there is something else. It indicates a very odd distribution, right? Now, on the other hand, you could have the norm as set in this case, clearly, not as a statistical concept at all. It's some notion of reason, rationality, etc. In which case it is not contradictory to say that most people are abnormal by that notion of norm. Adam, again, this question of historicism, Adam's gone. Historicism, I think what Foucault is suggesting here is that we take the contingency and indeterminacy of history seriously and reject the dialectical resolution or unification that's being suggested, right? No? Yes. I think that is really what is at stake.
That's what genealogy offers.
Yeah. So, finally, the boomerang effect. Just one note. Not finally, because I have Bernard's question. On the boomerang. I think one of the things that's interesting about the boomerang effect is there are all these techniques, as Anne was saying, which are developed in the colonies, right? Things like, for instance, the two things I know very well about fingerprinting, food rationing, vaccination campaigns, those kinds of things.
Welfare.
Now, those are actually developed under conditions of despotic rule.
Yes.
Right? Now, the problem is, what are the conditions under which they can be brought back home where there is liberal governmentality, a democratization of sovereignty? Under those conditions, how is that brought back? And clearly, I mean, there are questions about war and so on become very intrusive. Rationing is introduced during the war. Finally, Bernard's question, the impossible stakes, right? Do we just let it go? Now, one option, of course, would be to say, and Foucault does suggest this, is to say that we refuse to pose the question as one between scientific truth versus liberal right. Now, how does one do this? It would obviously mean questioning both of those categories, right? And there are huge stakes involved there, right? Costs involved. If one is to say that we abandon scientific truth, we abandon liberal right. So that is one sense in which I would say it gets close to being impossibly high. The second thing, of course, one could say, but this whole category of civilization, that would be my response. Give it up, right? What does that involve? The anthropologists have been arguing for this for a long time. But in terms of a more doable, right, response, I would say what reminded me was Bernard Cohn, the historian and anthropologist of Chicago, once told me that I don't care what discipline you belong to as long as you're ashamed of it. And I think that would be to question disciplinarization of knowledge. I think that would be a place to start.
Thank you very much. As always, it's 2 hours.